How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to be discussing hormones, which are chemical messengers that are sent throughout the bloodstream to have an impact on certain organs and cells within our body. So we already talked about neurons and how they release neurotransmitters to bring about certain functions, but these hormones are going to be released by glands and then travel throughout the bloodstream to bind to certain receptors, and they can play a role in the growth of cells or the rate of breakdown of certain nutrients, or our digestive system, or our cardiovascular system, or our urinary system. So we'll take a deep dive today into all the organs and all the glands that help play a role in this endocrine system and what the functions that these hormones help regulate. Here we see all the different organs that are involved within our endocrine system. It's going to be a bunch of organs, cells, and tissues located throughout the body that secrete these different hormones. The brain will play a major function, and in particular, the master regulator of the endocrine system, the hypothalamus, is located here. And just all these different glands and different organs are going to release these different hormones to bring about certain changes within our body. So we'll take a look into each of these organs and what kind of hormones they secrete and what the actions of those hormones are. When we want certain actions to occur within our bodies, we can have these endocrine cells start to synthesize and release hormones to bring about certain actions. So let's say, for example, you just worked out, and in order to promote growth and repair of your muscle cells, we are going to release growth hormone into your bloodstream. So this endocrine cell is going to synthesize that hormone. It gets released into the bloodstream, and then as it goes along through our blood vessels, it's going to come into contact with receptors on certain cells. And hormones are a lot like neurotransmitters. They're chemical messengers that bind to specific receptors. So once that hormone binds to a receptor that it fits to and it has affinity to, that target cell is going to be effective. In this case, the binding of growth hormone to its receptor is going to promote protein synthesis and growth of that target cell. So if we want to bring about more changes within our body, we would secrete more hormones. If we want to pull it back and we want to downregulate a certain mechanism or function within our body, we would secrete less hormones. But in addition to the level of hormones that are released throughout our bodies, we could also impact the number of receptors that are located on cells. So let's say if we wanted an action to be downregulated, we didn't want that action to occur as often. If we decrease the amount of receptors, then we decrease the likelihood of a hormone binding to that receptor on a cell. So downregulation is when there is a lot of hormone being circulated throughout the bloodstream, and the response is that these target cells are going to break down and recycle these receptors and break them down into their individual amino acids. And by doing that, we decrease the amount of receptors on this cell, therefore decreasing the likelihood that the hormone binds, and then it slows down whatever action that hormone brings about. We also have upregulation. So when there's not a lot of hormones, but we want to promote a certain action occurring within a cell, these receptors can also be upregulated, where the cell will synthesize more receptors and they will bind to the membrane, increasing the chances that the hormone binds and then that the action does occur. Being that hormones are chemicals, we could classify them as either lipid-soluble, which is the case for many steroid hormones, which play a role in our growth and repair of certain cells, which play a role in our sex hormones, which help with certain aspects of metabolism. And then we have thyroid hormones, which also play a role in metabolism and gene expression as well. But then we have water-soluble hormones, which are more protein-based hormones. And we talked about in the past that because of their chemical structure, these hormones are going to be transported differently. And so these water-soluble hormones, these protein-based hormones, they have the ability to travel throughout the bloodstream. And the lipid-soluble hormones are going to need a transport protein in order to be delivered throughout the blood. Different hormones are going to have different signaling pathways in target cells, and depending on what signaling pathways occur is going to affect the actions that occur within that cell. And so, for example, we could have hormones that bind on the outside of the cell or hormones that bind on the inside, which is something you're seeing right here, where this lipid-soluble hormone, testosterone, which many of you have probably heard before, is able to freely bypass this plasma membrane and then bind on the inside to receptors in the nucleus, which leads to an upregulation of protein synthesis. And so different hormones are going to bind to different types of receptors. We discussed G-protein coupled receptors, tyrosine kinase receptors, guanylyl cyclase. And so, whatever occurs within the body, within the cell, whatever signaling pathway that's brought about, it is specific to that hormone, right? So all these actions that are occurring within our bodies are going to depend on what kind of hormones released, what kind of receptor that's binding to, and then what cell is this all taking place in? What is the function of that target cell? It turns out that one way the endocrine system is able to regulate itself is by releasing different hormones that can have different interactions with other hormones. And so a permissive interaction is when this hormone is released, but its effectiveness is not to its full potential. It can't be more effective until this permissive hormone is released in greater amounts. And so by releasing this secondary hormone, it boosts the effectiveness and the target cell response of our first hormone. That's a little bit different than a synergist effect, which is when two hormones basically, increase each other's effectiveness in the target cell response when they are released together. And then in addition to hormone interactions that help promote certain events, we also have certain hormones that oppose each other's activity. And this is one way that our endocrine system in our bodies are able to basically balance out this seesaw. Because again, a lot of our homeostasis, we don't want things going too far in one direction and the other. So this antagonistic relationship is one way to control the activity of another hormone. So that's going to be when one hormone opposes the action and the target cell response of another hormone. The level of hormone released throughout our bodies is regulated by a few different mechanisms. And so we'll go over those four. One is through our nervous system. And so if we want more or less hormone to be released, areas of our brain can synapse and neurons can release neurotransmitters at certain areas of the body to either lead to more hormone production and secretion or less hormone production and secretion. The second way we are able to increase or impact hormone levels are through chemical levels throughout the body. So for example, if there's a low level of calcium, this is going to be picked up by our parathyroid glands, and then they release a hormone, which we'll learn a little bit more about, called parathyroid hormone, which helps to increase calcium concentrations within our blood. We also have mechanical stimuli that can impact hormone secretion. And so this is the case during pregnancy, where the baby stretching out the cervix is going to lead to the release of oxytocin, which helps in the pregnancy process and the contractions of the uterus in order to push the baby out. So that's stretching, a mechanical stimuli. And then we also have the interaction that a lot of hormone levels are really controlled by, and that's releases of other hormones. And so, for example, when we increase the level of one hormone throughout the body, it may lead to the synthesis or production of another hormone. So there could be this multi-step process. If we want a specific hormone released, there may need to be other hormones that are released before that in order to control those hormone levels. So now let's talk about the different glands within our bodies and what kind of hormones they release and what functions those bring about. And first, we'll have to discuss the pituitary gland, which is made up of the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. They are going to receive signals from the hypothalamus, which again is the master regulator of our endocrine system. And so one thing we're going to see is that the anterior pituitary hormone, it receives signals from the hypothalamus, but it's able to create its own and synthesize its own hormones within these cells that are within this section of the pituitary gland. However, the posterior pituitary gland, it also receives nervous signaling from the hypothalamus, but it's not going to synthesize its own hormones. It's going to just release the ones that the hypothalamus basically synthesizes, and then they will be ejected from here. The anterior pituitary gland, it's going to have its specific cells which synthesize and release their own specific hormones. And so, we could break through those different types of cells. Somatotrophs are going to secrete growth hormone, which obviously is going to promote growth in certain cells throughout our body. Thyrotrophs are going to release thyroid-stimulating hormone, which promotes the activity of the thyroid gland, which we'll discuss later. Corticotrophs are going to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, which leads to increases in cortisol and other adrenal hormones like epinephrine. Lactotrophs are going to secrete prolactin, which promotes lactation, and then gonadotrophs, which release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are sex hormones and will bring about certain functions depending on if you're male or female sex. But how are those cells able to control the levels, or how do they know to synthesize and release more hormones or less hormones? And again, the pituitary gland activity is going to be regulated by the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus is going to have its own set of hormones that regulate the activity within the anterior pituitary. And either it's going to secrete releasing hormones, which is going to promote the release of certain hormones from the anterior pituitary, or it can release inhibiting hormones, which would slow down the production of certain hormones like growth hormone and prolactin. And so the hypothalamus plays this major role in regulating our hormone levels. So here you see how that works a little bit. The hypothalamus will release those hormones throughout the bloodstream here, this local bloodstream, and there's going to be capillaries and that pick up those hormones, and then they're transported very close by. And then when those hormones bind to receptors, it could either increase the amount of hormone production in the anterior pituitary, or it could decrease the amount of production from the anterior pituitary. And so how does the hypothalamus know how much how to basically promote certain hormones or inhibit certain hormones? Well, it's going to pick up on certain signals, right? And so it's going to work through this negative feedback loop. So let's say that we increase high levels of cortisol throughout the body, right? And the brain's going to get a signal after a while. If those elevated cortisol levels are present, it's going to then slow down this pathway that leads to that cortisol release. So again, most of our reactions in our body are negative feedback loops. So once we start creating cortisol and levels get too high, that then signals to the brain, okay, let's slow down production of ACTH, and then that's going to slow down production of cortisol release. I do want to make quick mention of one hormone that goes through a positive feedback loop, and that's oxytocin, which is produced by the hypothalamus and released through the posterior pituitary gland. But this will help with contractions during childbirth. And so once this hormone starts to get released and circulates, the higher levels of oxytocin will lead to more release of oxytocin. And that's an example of a positive feedback loop. And that helps with the childbirth. But most of these hormone mechanisms and hormone levels are regulated through negative feedback loops. Let's begin to talk about the different hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. First, we have growth hormone, which is released by somatotrophs, the most numerous cell within the anterior pituitary gland. And what growth hormone is going to do, it's going to promote growth in liver, in bone, in skeletal muscle, cartilage, all different types of tissues. And the way it's able to do that is by the release of what's called insulin-like growth factors. And so when growth hormone binds to these different tissues, there's going to be a release of insulin-like growth factors, and then they will bind to different receptors, including insulin receptors and IGF receptors on these different tissues, on bone, on muscle, and what it's going to lead to is the growth of those cells' size, and also upregulates protein synthesis. But hormones a lot of times will have secondary functions, and a lot of times hormones can affect metabolism. And so growth hormone enhances lipolysis, so we're breaking down lipids, and that energy can be used to promote growth. And then growth hormone will also lead to decreases in glucose uptake. Our hormones are impacted by not only our age and our genetics, but what we do day to day. So, for example, growth hormone, which helps promote cell growth and skeletal muscle and bone and cartilage, it can be impacted by what you are doing every single day. And so if you have good resting habits, if you're recovering, if you are exercising and, creating more testosterone and, eating high levels of amino acids in order to use as building blocks for protein synthesis, it's going to, all these things, all these positive behaviors are going to lead to the release of growth hormone, right? Which then is going to help you build those skeletal muscles, which a lot of athletes like to see, and a lot of the general population too. Helps promote strength and metabolism. And then negative habits, the increased blood levels of fatty acids, obesity, this is going to lead to less growth hormone being produced. And so I want to point this out because it's really important, just again, to keep in mind as health professionals, we want to promote healthy behaviors in order to, balance out and make sure all these systems are working properly within our bodies. But it's also important to recognize that it's not good to look at a hormone as good or bad. It's a nice hormone or an evil hormone. There's no such thing in science. We have certain functions and what it does. Because, you may say, oh, growth hormone, I want bigger muscles, harder bones, things like that. I want to promote that. Well, growth hormone could also have other impacts. And so when you think about cancer, the release of growth hormone is going to lead to the increase in size of those cancer cells as well. So it's not always black and white. It's not always, okay, good hormone, bad hormone. It has certain functions, and certain those functions are positive in the case of skeletal muscle growth and hypertrophy. But, it can have negative impacts as well, as in the case of cancer. So again, what we do and what, the things we do day to day in our aging and our genetics all impact these hormone levels and can all ultimately impact our health and our physiology. Thyroid stimulating hormone is going to do just as the name entitles. It's going to stimulate the thyroid gland, which produces T3 and T4. And so you can see sort of the chain of the things that needs to happen in order to get to the release of certain actions and the release of certain hormones, because T3 and T4, in order for it to be synthesized, it needs to have more production of thyroid stimulating hormone. In order to have more production of thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, we need more thyrotropin releasing hormone produced by the hypothalamus. And so again, these hormone levels are all regulated by different mechanisms within our bodies. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, is released by the anterior pituitary gland and controls the production of both cortisol and glucocorticoids, which are released by our adrenal glands. And so this comes from a larger precursor, POMC, and so this precursor is cleaved in order to make ACTH, which again can regulate those cortisol levels and bind to certain receptors. But also this hormone, depending on what actions are occurring in our body, can be cleaved again to make two other signaling hormones or proteins here, and which can lead, I know in alpha MSH, it leads to production of melanin. And so ACTH has a big role in all sorts of functions that occur within our bodies. These last two slides are probably less important for exercise science, maybe a little bit more if you're focused more in the health and medicine field, but prolactin is going to promote the production of breast milk, and it has a permissive relationship with estrogen and progesterone, which are going to help with that function occurring. Its production is controlled by the hypothalamus. And then we have follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which control different sexual systems within our bodies, depending on whether it's male or female. And so, sperm production or ovarian cycle, these two hormones are going to regulate that. And so, we are, talking about a lot of different hormones here that are going to lead to actions and hormones being released in other places in the body. So I'll stop the video here because, we talked about introducing the endocrine system and the different areas of the brain, including the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which create hormones. But in the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about other glands throughout the body and other organs that release hormones and what those hormones are going to bring about as far as function is concerned within our bodies.